Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Darnell. We really appreciate it. And as Darnell mentioned, I am the Office Managing Partner for our Houston office of KPMG. We are so excited to have been upgrading our sponsorship to the sustaining board level in recognition of the critical role that all of you play in protecting our capital markets. KPMG is really thrilled with you to be in person with you today in this morning and to help explore the board's role in navigating climate change. I'm honored to introduce you to Stephen Brown, who is the Senior Advisor in KPMG's Board Leadership Center, who will moderate today's panel discussion and hopefully draw you all in to the conversation. So Stephen, you and the Gregs have, the pressure is on. Stephen has been the driving force of KPMG's BLC exploration of the board's role in climate change and broader ESG conversation. Stephen is a governance thought leader, frequent speaker, and recognized by the NACD as one of the 100 most influential people in corporate governance and the boardroom. Stephen is an attorney and previously led corporate governance team at TIAA, where as an investor, he interacted with boards and management teams to enhance transparency and strengthen corporate governance. He also taught corporate governance and has served on various boards. And with that, Stephen, I will turn over the mic to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here. And again, the way we'd like to do this in speaking about this topic is that I'm delighted to have the technology where you can ask questions through the app, I think, or you can ask questions in person, I believe, because we do want to make this interactive, and we have these great talents here. Let me just set this up very simply, which is that I think the issue of climate change is fairly simple, but for the fact of all the complications involved with the fact that it comes at a time, when we think about 2022 and the run-up here, that the ideas around transparency in corporations is the highest that it's ever been. Investor power, institutional investor power, and I used to be one of them, the highest that it's ever been. Most Americans invest in the stock market through aggregated pools of money. They're mutual ones, 401k, 403b, what have you, and that money goes into these aggregated pools, making those aggregated pools the #1 investor in companies like the ones that you have served, the BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguards, and considerable amount of power there. The employees, and by the way, most of your employees are not me and not us, they're millennials. And the way they think, and they're millennials and Gen Z, I should say. Often we meaning me, will conflate the two. They're different. The millennials will tell me, no, look at Gen Z, they're the ones that are a problem. But they think differently about work. They also think whether they will go to work, where they will go to work, what they want out of work, the idea of authenticity. I want to bring my authentic self to work. I've never said that in my life. But I've had to learn what that means. And when you start to learn what that means, you get a little bit, just a little bit more comfortable with it. Geopolitical politics, we don't have to sort of say too much about that, other than I was at a program earlier this week in California with the lead director of another large, one of the United States' largest companies, oil producer that's not Exxon, where the lead director said, my CEO is on a first name pen pal basis with the president. And in 1 week, the president says, you gotta pump more oil. And the next week, someone from the White House says, yeah, you guys should shut down. And so we have all that going on. And the last thing about what makes this experience that we are all in today, is the issue of trust. Mm-hmm. And we look at the Edelman Trust Index, the PR firm that does this every year, looking at trust throughout the world. Last year was the first year that corporations became the #1 institutions which people trust, beating out government, beating out religion. And before we take a victory lap as corporate America, just understand the pressures of that. Because if you look at the data, people said, I trust my manager. And they used that phrase, I trust my manager. I want my CEO to speak out on different issues. That's the condition that we are in today, where people go to work and they trust corporations, and quite often they're asking corporations to do things which other institutions probably should do. So that's where we are, and I'm so thankful to have the two Gregs, because they're going to answer all these questions, right? Greg Ebel is, as you know from his bio, director of Enbridge, the Mosaic Company, and Baker Hughes, former CEO of Spectra Energy and Spectra Energy Partners, and a whole bunch, until he retired a few years ago, and a whole number of things. And after speaking to him, he does have all the answers, and the answers that he doesn't have, the other Greg has. Greg Goff is founder and president of G&S Energy and GJG, does that make GJG,
yeah.
A real estate development company,
yeah.
Right? And overall guru in this space is director of Exxon Mobil and Aviant, formerly an executive of Marathon Petroleum and other places. I just want to let these guys go at it, and I will be the referee here. You guys understand what referee means, right? I'm just checking, because this is Astroland. Sorry, just another dig here. When we talk, I know that's awful. When we talk about climate change and the role of boards, what are the challenges actually facing boards today? So let's start with that, and I'm going to start off with the Greg closest to me.
Okay, well, I think the first one, it's funny, when we had our discussion, we didn't talk about Edelman, but that's writ large in my, the good news about COVID and the bad news about COVID, that corporations' trust level went up. In fact, not only the most trusted, the only organization group, if you take all the NGOs, corporations, media, government, that actually saw trust improve during that period. So that's great news. The bad news is now we have to speak with a more careful, deliberate point of view. But on the other hand, I think transparency is probably a better place for us to be than a lot of those other groups. Nothing against government NGOs and stuff, but I think our agenda is a pretty clear one. So I think one of the big things is transparency. I think secondly, the big issue that we're grappling with is, I think we make the climate issue a little bit too complicated, frankly. It is not that different from most other business issues, A. B, if we can line it up with where we're going corporately strategically, I think you can actually end up in a good spot. So the biggest issue I find is that too many corporations and boards are trying to be all things to all people on climate. You have to recognize what you can actually do and set those targets and stick with them. I'm just not a believer that you're going to make all stakeholders happy. And I think there's too many, just like any other strategy, corporations can probably focus on 3 to 5 things in a big way. And if you're trying to solve each and every element of climate change and not recognize what you can't do, I think that's a big problem. So, the issue of, well, short-term, long-term, we're good at that anyways. All of you are out there setting short-term and long-term goals with management teams. You're all out there setting short-term and long-term incentive structures with management teams. The same thing we're grappling with, I think, on climate change, but I think we make it a lot harder than we should, because we're not going to get everybody on side with our businesses. I'm in the Mosaic business, one of the companies I chair, it has its motto. And I don't think I've seen a better motto for a corporation is, we help grow the food the world needs. Well, who could be opposed to that, particularly in this type of environment? But I can show you a very long list of people opposed to fertilizer companies and all over the world, right, even in this environment. The same thing in oil and gas companies. Sure, I mean, Enbridge will move 25 to 30% of all the natural gas and all the oil in North America. It also has a huge renewable portfolio. The people that don't like you aren't going to focus on the $8 billion in renewables. They're going to focus on the tens of billions of dollars you have in pipelines. So I think it's just being comfortable in your own skin is a really important issue we have to grapple with and recognize you're not going to get everybody on side.
Yeah. Greg, I'm going to be saying that often. Greg?
So I think, just to add to it, the biggest challenge is that we're dealing with a change. I actually don't refer to it as a transition, but to a change over a long period of time. And so as a company, you'd worry about today, tomorrow, and further out in time, but the changes that we'll go through, both as businesses and as a society, are going to occur over multi-generations. And the decisions that you make have actually big impacts over time. And so from a corporate board standpoint, I think that dynamic of managing duration is something that's quite different than what companies are used to, because you see some companies set targets to tie into 2050, which is a long ways off, and then people start to bring those targets a little bit closer in. But from an oversight standpoint, I think it's in working with the leadership of a company, it's managing that duration and all the changes, because there's so many. Ann and I were talking about this earlier. There's so many variables in that process of change that have to be dealt with, and I think it draws upon everything that boards have to offer to deal with that.
Anna, we were talking at lunch about the financial services leaders that came before Congress were called, but they didn't voluntarily come. They were called to Congress, and I want to ask you, how do you? Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan was asked, is he still investing, or would he divest from fossil fuels? And he said, slamming the brakes on new oil and gas production, quote, would be the road to hell for America. And that rang nicely to some, rang horribly to others. But if you were asked that question, which I'm asking you now, should we stop the brakes on oil and gas production? What would be your response? And I'm going to start with the Greg on the end and then come here.
Well, I believe that the change that the world's going through, like I said, is going to happen over a very, very long period of time. So it's absolutely unrealistic to see anything in the short term that would change the needs of society today. And we need to meet those needs, and we can see what's going on in the world with the kind of the control that can be exercised if you have the resource. So and it's always been the case, actually. It's, whether you're fighting a war, you need energy to move the troops. And it's the change is happening for so long that the industry needs to be viable, highly functioning, and it is the driver of the change. So you need to support the driver of the change. I believe that there'll be the big companies that have been in the business, some for 150 years, will continue to be a critical part of it. But I think the more interesting part of it will be the entrepreneurs and the innovation that are always on the side that create ideas and maybe start up new businesses. That the fact is, when it gets to the point, it'll probably always be capital intensive, and those people don't have the capital that it takes to do it. And so to support that and to be able to move forward, I think you need to be able to have companies like what Jamie Dimon said, that you need that capital that can go in and seek the returns that the investors expect from it to actually do good things. And a good thing today is producing oil and gas and preparing to do other things at the same time. I mean, it's just a very crazy question, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I would
Senator,
agree.
what would you say?
Well, that's a no, thing to say. That's like saying you're a Yankee fan to say.
He got me back. He got me back.
Sorry, Steve. No, I actually think as boards, I mean, Jamie is Jamie, so he's pretty blunt out there, but maybe slightly more diplomatic would be, I think the board's responsibility and companies' responsibilities, and energy companies of all kinds, our job is to find that intersection between rhetoric, policy, and capital to maximize the profit for our companies. That is a key goal, while at the same time being sustainable. And so to that center, I say, when you guys and gals line up those three things, you can do whatever you want, but so far we're not there. The rhetoric is at a 10. I mean, we all know what the Paris Climate Accords are, right? How many people have actually met those goals? Virtually none, including all the people. So that's rhetoric. Rhetoric's at a 10. Policy, I think, is only at a 1 or a 2. I mean, we can't build infrastructure in this country and in most places in the world, regardless whether it's renewable transmission lines or it's oil or gas pipelines, even when it involves keeping tough parts of the world i.e. Putin's latest little tourism activity. We can't even agree to how we can go and help those folks. I would say that the policy side's not there yet either. There's talk about it. I guess the Inflation Reduction Act, whatever you think about it, does have elements that are positive in terms of carbon sequestration or renewables or stuff. We can argue about whether it's too much, too little, or whatever, but there's some policy moves there. And then capital, which is what we're all required and tasked with putting to work in a sustainable manner, both economically and environmentally. I actually think that's closer to a 3 or a 4, maybe even getting to a 5. Companies are willing to put capital to work, but until those 3 things, rhetoric, policy, and capital align, I would think the question is ridiculous. I mean, you can't, that's not going to happen. And so, again, I go back to this is a very long transition, as Greg said, and you can see it where a year ago, people were talking about how much clean energy, period. Now they're talking about energy affordability and security alongside food security and affordability, and people are starting to see the linkage between those things. So I'm actually really optimistic, Stephen, because I actually think for the first time maybe in 6-7 years, you're starting to see us back to the world of all of the above. I think people are realizing it's not a zero-sum game. We talked about this in the call, like, you probably know the answer to this, Greg, but how many people, well, in 2010, the average mile per gallon for a car in North America was 24 miles per gallon. What do you think it is today? Anybody have an idea?
Same.
36. So we have increased our energy efficiency of the combustion engine, at least in cars, by about 50%. What do you think's happened to gasoline demand? Continued to go up. That's a good example, and yet there are more electric cars, so we're going to have to get comfortable. It's not about taking entirely away instantaneously or adding. They're not really even trade-offs. They're just good examples of we have to figure out how to do things on a more sustainable basis, yes, but you're going to have to realize it takes a very long time to be able to get some of these transitions. I know you don't like the transition word or change. It takes a long time to get there, and we should be comfortable with that.
By the way, but on that, the use of the word transition, what's your issue with it, and why do you prefer another descriptor of that?
Well, a transition means that you're going from, to me, it means you're going from one place to some place that may be very different. I just think we're changing. I don't know if we'll get to a completely different place.
Sure.
I think we'll get to a place that is a better place, but it may not be as dramatically different as where we are today.
Gotcha.
I think we'll find ways to get there, so I don't think that's a transition. I would like to comment on one thing that Greg said and kind of build out the comments about the policy. I personally think that the biggest challenge that exists, and this is something for boards to determine how companies engage in that, but to me, if you had climate change and you were trying to find solutions to drive the changes that you want to get, if it's lower CO2 or whatever, if you gave that to a group of business leaders, I kind of believe they'd come up with a good solution. It would be, you would deploy, because it's a massive amount of capital, so they would find ways to effectively deploy the capital. They would be able to, a group of business leaders would be able to find a way to put a framework in place to drive the change that you want to be able to do. And for lots of reasons. I mean, one, they have knowledge, they have experience, they have lots of skills that allow them to do that. But today, when you talk about policy, so we have people that are, in my opinion, making decisions on one of the most critical changes we're going to go through in our lifetime, because to me, it's all about competition. And I fundamentally believe that because energy is such a vital part of our own lives, it's a vital part of the state we live in, the country we live in, and the policies that are set in place, they absolutely have to maintain or enhance our competitive position as a country around the world. I believe if we fail to do that, then for my grandchildren and their grandchildren, the world's not going to be a very good place. And so the concern I have is the need to develop these right policies. Unfortunately, we probably have the wrong people doing that because they don't have what it takes. And so you have to say, well, that's an opportunity to find a different way because of the amounts of capital, the way you can stimulate innovation and creativity. I mean, the policies that we've set in the past aren't going to be able to do that. So climate change, to me, that is the most critical issue because of the time, the amount of capital, the things that need to happen. You would just want people you have more confidence in can get you to a better place.
Alas, that's not happening, right? At least not now. I mean, we'll talk about that. Quite frankly, when we talk about policy and the politics, we have a Congress that has over 500 people, who have state legislators who have just as much, if not more. And you have a constituency, which is vast, from employees to shareholders who think different things. And I appreciate how you gave the numbers and that where we are on policy, or at least the understanding of what's at stake and how to get on that road. We're at a 1. That said, that's where we are. Right. And we're all board members serving on boards. And I just want to talk about sort of what boards need to do. First, starting with their competencies. And there's a concept of that, at least it's in the SEC rules or proposed rules, which will go functional, and then we'll get sued, and some of it will be functional in the next few weeks, that you have to have a climate expert on the board, or tell us who the climate expert is on the board, or explain why. So that's my question is, do boards need to have climate expertise sitting around the table, or there's an alternative? And I'll start with you, Greg.
If we're trying to get an expert on all the things that boards do, so you've got climate, you have energy transition, you have cybersecurity, you have digitization, you have strategy, whatever. I think either you'll have boards that start to look like some of these poor performing policy bodies, and you won't get. So I'm not a big believer in that. A, B, nobody's fully gone through climate change. Or climate adaptation, however you want it. Nobody's gone through full energy transition yet. So I'm not sure where you get those folks. So I realize the SEC is asking us to do that, and as boards and people very much wanting to be compliant with whatever the duly put together rules are, we'll figure out a way to speak to this issue. Not different than the way we look to financial experts, right? You have to identify a financial expert on the board. He or she does not necessarily have to be an accountant. They have to have had oversight of the preparation of financial statements or actually have been involved. So I think there's a way to deal with it, but I think getting a climate expert, how many of those are here today again? Yeah, so I think it's a really difficult thing. Now, people that have deep knowledge of energy transition, environmental issues, etc., as part of their quiver of skills, I think that's great. But that's what we should be looking for anyways, and you try to balance it, at least as a chair, you're bringing on people on the board who've got those skills, those big geopolitical viewpoints, strategy, etc. And oh, by the way, may have gained that through, I don't know, maybe they were the head of Greenpeace at one point in time, or maybe they were on the board of ExxonMobil. I think you can get it without actually having a solely specific expert. And I think the board's fundamental call to the management team is, if we want an expert, and I would say this on any issue, we're going to go out and get one to come and speak to the board. And we do that all the time. There is excellent education. I don't think it has to be somebody on the board. And in fact, I could see that be damaging. A single issue person on the board has generally not worked well in my experience. I don't know about all of you.
Yeah. I think a possible solution, first of all, I think you need to look at different industries because they're absolutely impacted differently. But if we focus, say, on energy, then a possible idea is to have, for the board, or even a committee of the board, to have access to an independent firm that can provide background on climate change, just like you do from an auditing or compensation. And therefore you get the breadth and wealth of the knowledge and that of many experts, because there is no expert on climate change. And I agree with everything that Greg said about, when you try to do that, you actually maybe lessen the value of what you're trying to accomplish from a governance standpoint. So I would kind of advocate that maybe you need to think ahead and say, if you're in the energy business, maybe you provide, whether it be a sustainability committee or whatever committee that has maybe responsibility for that, or even the board, access to an independent firm that has broad expertise that can help them think through some of the risks and the challenges and that for the business.
Your response reminds me of something a few years ago when I was working for Dennis, and there was an outside company. We were looking at a product. They had this product that would deliver to independent board members information, data, news stories that they said were independent, and they're defunct now because as they pitched it, they would go to boards and say, "This is what we want to do," and the board says, "Great, we don't have a checkbook. Go to the CEO, and he'll do it." And they went to the CEO, and the CEO said, "Great, there is no way I'm allowing you to give information to my board without coming through me first." And so maybe they're defunct now, but maybe they're retooling a way of trying to include management before they give information to you. But that's an interesting. I think you're absolutely right in terms of allowing the board. You don't have to buy it. You can rent it. Right. Which, by the way, the rules already allow you to rent. Most rules say, or all the rules say, you can have whatever expert you need.
Yeah.
It's whether you actually use that ability
and how you use it.
And how you use it. Are there minimum? That said, are there some minimum skill sets that board members should have in thinking about this issue?
Well, I think you need board members that are very comfortable with risk management and VUCA, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. I just think that's gone up the trail huge, and very comfortable in management teams and the board pivoting as we move around. Yes, we know we're going to, Dorothy Abels and I used to work for a CEO that said, "We're going to Portugal." And what he meant is, I don't know how we're going to get there, but that's where we're going. And we're going to stop off at different places, but we are going in that direction. So you can have that. But the boards, I think, need to have be very comfortable with that risk management and living in that volatile world. And I think a big element of that is equally self-awareness of who the company is and self-awareness of who the board is. And I think if you can mix those things together, you're going to do well. It's still business. It's still a business problem. You still have to fundamentally make the returns your investors want and do it in a way that at least meets the minimum standards of most of your stakeholders. Those that want you to shut down your business, whatever it is, that's not going to be possible. So I still see it as a typical business problem with probably a longer, not probably, but definitely a longer look than your typical strategy issue. That'd be my view.
Yeah, I think, Greg talked about it in some of the early comments that he made around that it's not that different. And I fundamentally agree with that. And I think you want some of the same skills, great strategic thinking, being able to look at risk, being able to have experience with change, driving change. And then to me, one of the most important things is around the culture, to create a work environment and that is, supports the change that needs to happen and how you go about changing and attracting the people that are going to be part of it, because different generations may view it a little bit differently. Right. So you've got to manage the complexity of people's points of view in that, because you need all those to be successful. So I think he hit it right on the head when he basically said it's not a lot different, and the value of a board is it's a collection of people with different experiences, knowledge, skills, and what's important is taking all that and putting it to good use to do the right things for the company to create value. Just building on that, Greg, I think that we're all better situated for issues not related to climate change. We are not there yet, but we have come a long ways on diversity and inclusion. And I think boards now, if you writ large that, not focused on necessarily the direct issues of who's on your board, but the way in which decisions are made at a board. Very few boards now have a special executive committee, first amongst equals. You don't have that. And I think boards are improving, and I think it will
pay dividends on actually being more inclusive in their decision making, both as board members but also with management teams. And I think that's a big change. I think board members are going to be asked on this issue, and we'll see how confident our management teams are in that. I hope they're of actually participating, maybe even externally. And I know not all boards want to do that, and not all directors are aligned or seeming that way, but I mean, not increasingly, but we still have, half the boards are an independent chair, and half don't have that. In some countries, as you know, that's a standard where it's completely an independent chair. And I think chairs and board members who may have an expertise should be expected and utilized as a counsel, but even an external benefit. I mean, we are increasingly seen as ambassadors for the corporation, both internally and externally. And I think we're going to have to step up and work with our management teams how to do that. It's a little bit scary in terms of, well, wait a second, we don't want to be misaligned, but these are all bright people with a lot of good skill sets. So I think that whole inclusivity is going to be really an interesting asset if we use it the right way.
When I was head of stewardship as an investor, when I talked to directors, I wanted to see how they made decisions, see how the board made decisions.
Absolutely.
And by the way, and the reason why I wanted to talk to the director, because directors could talk to it. When you talk to the head of IR or even the CEO sometimes, that's usually who you got.
Right.
You just didn't get that flavor. I mean, they could talk their own book. But talking the book of the board, and by the way, so this is my takeaway, is that management can talk the book of the company, but a lot of times they can't talk the book of the board, of how the board makes decisions, how they think through issues. And that's really what investors who, by the way, are your only natural enemy, they have a vote on you. No, they're the ones who have a vote on you. And more today, they're more willing to say no, right, than it was 10, 15 years ago. You mentioned an issue about culture and the board looking at culture, and I know we've talked about this, how important it is for the board to get deeper with management about culture, about their employees in particular. For oil and gas companies who you need to communicate with because A, they work for you, B, they can decide not to work for you, but they're also hearing what everyone is hearing about what they want and what they don't want. Maybe they're embarrassed to actually go back to their reunion in college and say who they work for. And they're going to keep that quiet because maybe it's a third rail with certain people. Can you talk about the board, and this is a fairly new space that folks are trying to demand that boards have more involvement in, is getting a handle on how management has a handle of understanding their employees?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm always hesitant with the word culture. I think it's it's a bit like back in the old days, whatever the Supreme Court said, pornography, when you see it. Like, it's really hard to define, and I still struggle with kind of defining it, but a good culture when you see one, right? So I think there are other ways. Yes, the board needs to be more involved, and the board and management teams, I would think, want to do more and more sounding of their people in an anonymous way to see where are our people today. But I think the board can look at it through multiple ways. Succession. Succession planning is a huge opportunity to see. So let's look at that from a climate perspective, right? As you look at development plans for your senior leaders, and you look at those senior leaders and even the next gen leaders, how are they actually weaving in climate change, transition, adaptation, however you want, into, if they have a financial role, if they have a strategy role, if they have an ops role, if they have an HR role, how are those actually being weaved in? So I think there's ways to get at seeing whether or not there's culture adaptation and development on important issues without creating a whole new reporting line to the board. I know that's not what you were saying. At the same time, I also think, in my experience, and I see it even more and more today, and maybe this goes back to your Edelman comments about trust of organizations, our employees, they are hungry to be able to have information that they can talk about in their backyard, in their community events about the company. And I would say boards have responsibility to say, are we doing enough to not only see that we're armed with the facts that we need, but our employees too. Frontline employees are awesome, right? I mean, they are just incredible deliverers of messages on their company if they have the message to deliver. Right? I mean, they're facing it. I mean, in the pipeline business, I can tell you, you have people on the front line being yelled at, swore at, threatened physically. I mean, forget all the stuff we see in the newspapers about these issues. These are, and if those people are not trained and taught how to deal with it, you have conflict. And that's always a loser for the company. Regardless if the people are crazy going at you, that's a loser for the company. So training those people, and I've been so proud as I've seen over the last few years in some of these industries, how people on the front line, not necessarily what we call leaders, have really stood up and acted in an appropriate way, kept calm, and delivered the company's message at the same time as delivering the product or the asset that we asked them to deliver on. So I think you got to dig deep and look at it, but I think there are ways to do it without actually telling employees it's culture.
Yeah, I try to simplify it, and I kind of break a company into two parts. It's kind of what they do, and then it's how they do it. And then if you say, and we've all dealt, probably all of us are very knowledgeable and experienced on the what part of it. And we also have a lot of that on the how. Because the how, like I think Greg mentioned, there's a lot of different things that comprise the how. And at a board level, I think you have to step above it and recognize what your role is, but the success of any company is how they manage both of those. And I kind of view them equal. I think what you do is, and how you do it, they're equally important, and you need to focus on both of those at the same time. And the how is, I mean, it's a lot of things we've been doing. It's the philosophy of compensation. How do you reward people? Because that helps frame the culture of the company, and how you succession planning, the type of, from a board, the type of CEO they recruit, and his or her leadership style and skills, and because they have a big impact on setting the tone. So I think you're right, Stephen. It's something that it's a little bit harder area to talk about, but I think you have to take a step above it and frame up how you want to talk about how. Because like Greg said, culture means a lot of different things, but so does strategy. So do a lot of things in business. We could ask a lot of people in this room about strategy, and we get 100 different definitions, which is not bad. It's just people from their own perspective. And the value that a board can bring to the how is, from the experiences. And I always believe that the most important value is inquiring. It's seeking to understand. You said it, kind of what's the place, the smell of the place, to go back to that old saying. But what is the smell of the place? And there's lots of ways companies can get to do that. And but I think it's an important thing. And as we relate to what we're talking about with climate change and that, I just think it's such a critical variable in managing the change that we're going through, because it's the people and how the company goes about it that's going to determine their success.
I like your comment about the smell of the place, because that's often what so I'm putting back my investor hat on. That's what I want to get in talking to a director, or if I've talked to management, what directors do to understand what they do. So I have one more question for me, then I'm going to go to the questions that have been asked, and we're going to sort of do Q&A. And it has to do with, maybe, I'll figure out the question. Let me just set it up, which is where I think we are today in 2022 and going forward is that the modern board, an assessment of the modern board today is very personal. And it started really post the financial crisis in 08. I was still an investor then, and we sort of got together as a large group and said, what happened? What did we miss? And one of the things that came out was that we weren't really focused on who's sitting on the board. So that's why board composition, who sits there, how they do their jobs, has been a big issue since '08 for the investor community. And we started to focus on it. And the evolution today is that there's still a focus. And we have, as of early September 1st, universal proxy. So if there's a challenge to a board with a proxy fight, there are 9 seats, there are 12 people running, everyone's going to be on one ballot. So it's easier to pick and choose and vote. So it will be interesting as we see this go forward. And just a note on, some of my best friends are hedge fund activists, and it's fun to talk to them. And unlike what the papers say, obviously you were involved in a very big case at Exxon a couple of years ago. It's all about performance and value. But they are very good in running campaigns and how to use levers. And one of those levers might be climate change. The E and the S out of ESG. And they're going to use it to their advantage. And just your thoughts generally on what the job is for directors to ensure that management is telling the story. Because I think what we've talked about for the last 40 minutes is that you have to communicate, and your communication skills outwardly and inwardly to your employees has to raise. So when you were doing your number system we're on policy and innovation, communication is right up there, because I think we're lower than 5. Mm-hmm. Just general thoughts, and I will go to questions about the idea that you're checking in with management and how they communicate internally and externally, because that's really how we're going to drive the information.
Yeah. So I don't know, I think I heard a bunch of different questions there.
Yeah,
so,
good, okay.
So maybe I won't answer any of them,
There you go.
I don't know, because I'm not sure, but.
That's the way to do. See, I'm just preparing you when you go in front of Congress. Say, Senator, thank you very much, but I'm going to yield the mic to Greg.
Well, maybe just to share a couple thoughts. One is that I think a very powerful thing is creating ownership. Mm-hmm. So if you can create ownership for the people that work in the company, I believe you can perform at a lot higher level, and it's harder than it sounds. But secondly, actually, if you can create ownership in the board, I think you can create a different board. And the ownership in the board, to me, starts with the chairman, primarily, and to a lesser extent, the lead independent director. And I believe that if you get ownership by people in something, in this case we're talking about a public company, if you can create that ownership, I think you draw more out of people. You get people to perform at a lot higher level, which you really need. And you need it probably more than any time now to be able to deal with the challenges that public companies have from everywhere. I kind of view it as like a heavyweight boxer, and there are no rules. So you get in the ring, and you can get hit below the belt, and you get hit behind the head, and you can get kicked, and all those things. And so that it's a demanding thing. But if you can create that ownership of how your directors come together, because you have this very super highly talented experience, you have everything, especially if you were part of the process of choosing all the people that are directors of the board, just like you do your leadership team. If you get this collection of super talented people, then how you get them to work together, I think, is one of the most important things you can do. And I'm not sure all companies focus on that, to be honest with you. I'm not sure that there's enough attention put to that to be able to get the most benefits out of it, because it's extra work. They just don't come together naturally.
It kind of, I think, Greg, it comes back to your comment about, what you do and how you do it. So not only doing the right things, but doing the right things the right way. And I think that's true with boards and management. So I go back to, I think some of your question was, how do we know we're actually doing what we thought we set out to do and stuff? But I think boards increasingly, at least the 2 boards that I chair, I set out a priority list for the board obviously in concert with the CEO at the beginning of the year, single page, no more than 10 things. Here's the things that we need to focus on. And that's always at the back of the board book, and it's a little bit of motherhood and apple pie with a few very specific things that need to get done in that year. And, constantly checking in. When you think boards only get together, 4, 5, 6 times a year, hopefully. Sometimes it gets more than that when things happen. Actually doing gut checks on, are we doing what we set out in the year? That creates a tone at the top as well that the CEO almost by definition realizes, I need those things. And the same with strategy. Here's the things when we left, we probably all have a strategic retreat every year, or maybe even a detailed one every other year. It depends on your corporation, what you're doing, how things move, how fast they move. What are the things, the half a dozen or maybe 8, maybe less, we said we were going to come out, and a document actually put together and constantly checking in on those things? And if an element of that is not about culture or human talent, or use whatever word you want, enabling factors, which may be technology, may be people or whatever, then I think it's hard to constantly hold yourselves accountable. And if you're not holding yourselves accountable as a board, then why should management hold itself accountable? And I almost guarantee if those things aren't there, your comp program's misaligned with what perhaps you're saying externally.
And Greg, thank you for putting some sense to my sort of screwed up question. I appreciate it. So I do have questions from the audience, and so you can't blame me if they're not grammatically correct or what have you. Many companies have set net zero and climate accord goals for 2030, 2040, 2050, but many of those same CEOs will be retired by then. You better believe it. How is the next generation of leaders going to meet, reset, or adapt to those goals?
Yeah, to me, that was kind of the essence of my point around managing duration, is exactly that question that someone asked, is that your companies are setting these targets going way out in time, and everyone sees it and maybe raises lots of questions, and which at the end of the day says, how valuable is it? To be honest with you, at the end of the day, I mean, you can do and say what you want to do, but it's how valuable is it? And so, to me, it's back to that managing duration. And so I think what's the most important thing is that, it is a journey, and you can actually measure your journey kind of a few steps at a time. So what you need to do is be able to focus on 2 things. One, how you're progressing and how you're preparing. So that you're, managing what you do, however far out you go, but that you're making progress to some ultimate vision that you have. And then secondly, how you're preparing, like you said, Stephen, for the next generation of leaders. And I think that's the whole essence of the problem of managing climate change, is it's a long-term thing, and you just have to look at it how you want to address it.
Gotcha. I have another question, and this is a really great question, and we've talked a little bit about how we've moved to a world where we want business to solve problems, which probably the state or government should. And here's a question around, and I just lost it, sorry, about the food system, so I'm going to give it to you, which is, given the dysfunctional state of our legislative processes over the past several administrations, can we solve today's food system challenges without government participation or regulation, or will it take us getting to a point of Depression-era type pain before we do it?
That's depressing. Well, the old adage, crisis creates opportunity. I think we're seeing it writ large. I mean, I doubt many people understood that 45% of Europe's fertilizer came from the Ukraine and Russia 6 months ago, or 70% of sunflower oil and seeds came out of the Ukraine. So that's creating new opportunities. So we can't do it without government, but I think it'll be business going to government in the right way, not loud, bombastic, called before the Senate, but really trying to be partners of choice for regulators and policymakers on solutions. Let's face it, government is about power. Government is about staying in that power. They're looking for solutions. I think whether you're a Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. We know that the idea of being firm on one issue or another is, their classic firm but flexible, but most of all fair to all people, right? I mean, that's how they operate. And if we can bring them solutions to their problems, and I think you have to, I think we can be the germinator of those solutions, but you have got to have government, and it takes crises, and we're seeing it with energy too, where they have a little bit of, Muhammad come to the mountain kind of thing moment where they realize that we need business and we need their solutions, and they can take credit for it, and that's perfectly fine. I think we have to accept if they want to take credit for whatever. Same with activists. Think about, they're no different than hedge fund activists. And I really thought I liked you, but then you told me you're a Yankees fan and you like hedge fund activists.
Well,
So
I like going, they throw nice dinners.
They do throw nice dinners. And we should all think that way, right?
Right.
So if you're thinking like an activist, then I think you're going to be in a better spot on some of these crisis issues. And that's the whole issue with pace, pace and how quickly. It's a comfort with VUCA.
Right.
So it does take crises, but that's okay.
By the way, my love affair with activists is just simply, I understand the competition for ideas.
Yeah.
Right. And that when there's a proxy fight, activists come into one room, management comes in the other room. And my experience is just I hear whining from one side, and then I hear it's sort of a concrete plan. And many times we decide even with the whiners. I shouldn't say that, I'm sorry. But it's gotten better, where they understand that this is a fight about ideas.
Yeah.
And then ultimately about people who can execute those ideas.
Right.
And by the way, it's a fight. And I always remind now as a consultant that it's a fight, and it's like mud wrestling with a pig, which is that you're both going to get dirty, but the activist likes it. Like they do this for a living, so try not to get, because this is what they do for a living. They want to fight.
But do you find the ideas are? My point was the ideas are not necessarily that far apart.
That's
either,
correct.
Right. So if somebody needs the credit because they're in government and they're solving a problem, I hope we don't get to depressionary issues. I think this winter is going to be very painful in parts of the world for food, let alone energy. But if somebody else needs the credit, I think we're fine with that. That's how we run with corporations. CEOs and boards hopefully are helping to set the stage, but it's the employees that deserve the credit. They're the ones that go out and execute it day to day. And I think we're all very comfortable with that. Yeah. Our comp program should suggest we're very comfortable with that.
And here's a question about being comfortable. What are your thoughts on reconciling being comfortable with risk management with good governance? So what does that mean to get comfortable with risk management?
Well, first of all, I don't think you ever get comfortable with it, to be honest with you, because comfort's not a good place. Because if you're comfortable, then you may become complacent, and you don't want to do that in anything that you do. So I kind of like uncomfortableness actually in almost everything, because it's stimulating. It makes you think about things, question, and actually be nervous. And I think you should always run a little bit scared.
Yeah. I agree. That's back to this whole VUCA thing. If anything, I'm comfortable about it's that volatility. I think it's actually pretty exciting as companies. Most of us are involved with really solid, well-financed, well-structured companies. And so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity are actually assets to figure out how to use to advantage against companies that aren't well run, capitalized, or structured. Right? It's the job.
It's a darn good job because people aren't leaving it. As we know, the director positions, even though being a director is much harder today than it was certainly much harder than 10 years ago. I think harder than where it was 5 years ago for all of what I've just said about the sort of the modern board and the demands on you. By the way, do they, man, if I were still an investor and you came to see me, I'd walk out of that room, both of you. I'd walk out of the room like, man, I like those guys. And you got my vote. And I would proselytize when I met other investors. But you guys don't. People like you aren't going to see investors. That's my point. I think the challenge is getting the right talent who have the right mindset to be great communicators. in this case.
And not see investors only when there's a problem. Right. This is another battle, I think, not battle, this is another good issue for us to work out with we've worked for them. Some senior managers don't want you anywhere near investors, some do. And I think that's a good cultural battle to have around the board table. Again, not everybody is skilled for that and necessarily set up for that, but I think chatting with investors, you may not say that if the issue was, well, you guys have had these operational misses and financial issues and so, and we wouldn't have a bigger discussion, but well, these guys actually have thought through things. If you think that's true, you'd be having a discussion about how you're putting out a fire that you shouldn't have let happen.
Right.
That's not a very comfortable place to be.
Do folks out there, by raise of hand, whether it's routinely or once in a while for your boards, talk directly to investors, do shareholder engagement?
Yeah, not enough.
Yeah, and it's now in Europe, it is part of the course.
Yeah.
It's growing in the United States. Of course, if there's a problem, like say on comp, there's no question they want to see the head of the comp committee. But on all other issues, it's a growing thing, and I struggle with it as a corporate lawyer, and it really depends on the person, right? Because a lot of board members think that they've talked to investors in the past as the CEO, they know what they're doing, they're going to do it, and they probably shouldn't.
Yeah, that's generally true. I think, especially if it's about financial matters and the quarterly result, that's not for the board to do. But sometimes, when you were an investor, sometimes it's just the offer. Like, comp chairs, the company should offer, would you like to see the comp chair? Every year that should go on. I will tell you the take up on that is 1 in 100. Right. But the benefit of that is 100%, right? Well, these guys are willing to talk to us. So. And then if there is an issue 3 years down the road, we've offered to talk to you each of the last 3 years and you've said no. But we're happy to talk to you now. Right. So it's like, well, we didn't know or whatever. I think it's just good board and
by the way,
management.
when that happens, just so inside baseball knowledge, that at least at BlackRock, they check. They got the call, and they don't need to talk to you because they don't have an issue, but they wanted to get the call. So that it just takes it off the list. So you're absolutely right. Are there other questions from the floor? I'm going to take a few more from here, but perhaps someone would like to ask it from the floor directly. We're all too shy. I'd rather just do it. So I'll take another one. Well, gain that courage, and while you do that, and I'm just going to read. Much is needed appears to require a foundation of knowledge in areas such as ethics. Many are no longer able to define or incorporate into their process. So many are no longer able to define sort of ethics into their process. Seems like a fundamental change that we all hope to achieve. And it's comments question. So I think this is about, which is why I wish you would ask it verbally in person, so I don't get the written grammar incorrectly. But the idea of incorporating your own personal ethics and then the culture of the corporation while you're doing your board work to sort of drive the discussion with management. And I think you guys already talked about that a little bit. I'm going to get to another question, which is capital is one of the factors to consider in the balance of policy and capital. How should boards think about capital allocation and balancing the rhetoric of stakeholders with the business needs to reinvest?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't love the word balance. I actually think it suggests there's less return for doing something on climate change. I actually don't believe that. I really don't. I think that's where finding that intersection of rhetoric, policy, and capital where you can make dollars. So I I think it comes back down to comp. If you've got key goals on climate and they're actually quantifiable goals, and you have key goals on return on capital employed, those by definition have to be quantifiable, and you set out those targets, management will measure what gets reported, and what gets reported and measured should get paid. So it all ties to comp. If you can get good work on the climate side, renewables, whatever you're doing, it's got to still meet whatever your standard is for return on capital employed, and you should pay for that. And if those three aren't lining up, or you can't line them up, there's a disconnect between what you're saying you're going to do and what you're paying people to do, and that creates a problem. So I'm not sure it's a trade-off. Yeah, there's short-term and long-term goals. Not all businesses have great returns in the near run, but you still have to, there's nothing sustainable about losing money.
Well, I always say the first rule of ESG or corporate social responsibility is that you got to keep your doors open.
Yeah.
Right? Seriously, I mean, we can chat about the approach Lehman Brothers had. They don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Right.
They failed that first rule, and that's deeply important. Here's a question. I'm going to modify it because it asks just a general question that we can ask at any one of these conferences, which is, what's the best way to get yourself known to be considered for the board? And I'm going to skew that a little bit. If you were to go take an NACD course to be climate competent, or there's another outfit that actually has a 6-month, I think it's 9 months course, about becoming climate competent, they have the same thing for cyber. And you say, hey, I've done it, I'm an expert, or actually, maybe I really am an expert. I'm a climate scientist. What say you if they're sitting in the room saying, hey, I got this, consider me? Now, what would be your reaction to that? Probably that's nice, but what else do you have? But I'll let you guys answer that.
Well, probably two things. The first is you hire a lot of firms to go out and search for directors, and so, but the way that process works, then you want to be recognized by those firms that are going to be searching, and that takes some time just to build up the relationship with those firms and demonstrate, what you offer, and then that kind of gets you into the flow of those, I think, of those opportunities. The second thing is just how you kind of network with people. I mean, Greg and I both served on the Enbridge board and kind of came through a network because we, our backgrounds and things like that. So being able to do that network and stay in contact with people. But I think you should, I think you should target what you want to do, because it's how you spend your time. And if it's just not going out to be on a board. It's kind of what is it you really want to do? And if you bring a particular skill to it, then target a group of companies. And I personally don't see anything wrong with reaching out to them and expressing your interest. It may take a little bit of time, just like anything else, but show them what value you can contribute to help them do what Greg said earlier. It's about creating, enterprise value. So I think those are the 3 steps I would recommend. And like you said, Stephen, it's not specific to climate change. It's anything you do.
Right.
Yeah, and I would agree with them on the firms. Like we all, I've had big changeover in a couple of companies I'm involved with through aging out, a few deaths, crazy stuff that you wouldn't, well, I would hope you'd think crazy stuff on deaths of directors and stuff like that. But the firms are still, that is a check, right? I mean, the networks, but they do have a good, because we're looking for, if it's just, well, I'm a climate expert, it's back to that question, well, do we just need a climate expert? The firms know what we want, and they're very good, I find, at putting a name forward, even if they don't know we're even looking for somebody. And if you're already part of a company, at management team, I'd get your board or your management team to support you getting a board too. I'm a big believer in that your number one job as management is for that company, but getting a board can be helpful. That's a good feeder network.
Well, you have a question here. Oil and gas industry has been focused on the environment or environmental issues for decades. Do you think the climate change topic should be a natural outgrowth of that effort, or do you think it's more? And great question, and let me just preface it by the fact of, and get you to respond to this. How about this, Greg? You see an advertisement from Facebook, Meta, or some company that's on TV that says, we're setting net zero goals at X by 2030. And I know sometimes we've talked about this, that you see that and you say, well, wait a minute. 12 years ago, I set a much higher goal that was 4 times that, but I'm not getting the credit. So, so oil and gas industry has been dealing with the environment for decades. Why is what we're talking about somehow heightened or new, or is it?
I don't think it is for the industry. I look at Enbridge, before that Spectre, before that Duke. We'd put out sustainability reports since the late 90s, which is, we're talking 25 years of sustainability reports. And when I see, love him, brilliant guy, Amazon Bezos folks say, we're investing $3 billion in renewables. I'm like, we already have $8 billion and we've turned it over multiple times, right? So, but that's okay. I think what it does say is we're not very good communicators. We're largely engineers, accountants, right? And so we have to do a job, and I think boards, this is a big thing, boards, and Exxon does it, I think, in a big way. You're gonna have to spend some money advertising, and I don't, and really, and we just did this at Enbridge, and I can tell you about the CEO and myself as the chair, we're like, God, I can't believe we'd spend that much money to get our story across. But you know what? You got to do it. You are a brand. And even though we're in the wholesale business, I know Exxon and Chevron are, a corner, they're on the corners, so it's a different brand. But everybody's got to do it now. So I think, yes, it's not new to us. Yes, we actually know what we're talking about, but B, we're not communicating that. So it's our fault.
Well,
So I'll probably take just a little bit different approach.
sure, okay.
Because I don't.
And in the last 3 minutes, we finally got to a little bit of dissension. Thank you. Great.
So I see the environment maybe quite a bit differently. I know that there are 2 people here, Tom Knutson and Debbie Adams, who started at Conoco when I did. And I'll just tell you, I think from a safety standpoint, personal safety, I learned that's probably one of the key things I ever learned. And not only did it change my life, but it changed the life of my family, because it changed how I looked at everything I did, from mowing the grass with a weed eater and having safety. Honestly, it fundamentally changed my life, and it's been with me. And everything I do today, 40 years later, it hasn't changed. I have a horse ranch outside of San Antonio, and you can go ask any of those guys that work there what I talk to them about. And it's their personal safety, always, and it's kind of, so I don't think the environment's the same, unfortunately. And I think, to me, and this is just my own opinion, I don't want it to be construed as being critical, but I think we did a good job when we actually didn't. And the reason we didn't is because competition drove things to the lowest common denominator, unfortunately. So you couldn't do things that you wanted to because other people weren't doing the things that they needed to do. And so I think we absolutely need to change our game dramatically. I think we have a responsibility to all of us to do that from an environmental standpoint. And I'm not an environmentalist. I do love nature at the heart of who I am as a person. I grew up in the mountains of Utah, and I love fresh air, blue skies, green, fresh water. I love everything like that. And I think we should protect it. And we can do that. We can produce oil and gas and do everything that we need to. But the fact is, I can tell you, one job I had at ConocoPhillips was running the E&P business in North America. And I could go out to Colorado and look where we were drilling wells, and we tore up half the damn mountain to get the drilling rig there. We built a 4-lane highway. And did we need to do that? I don't know. But that's the environment. And so I think we actually need to have a lot higher standard. I think we need to have a lot higher standard. And also, I agree with Greg that we need to, how we communicate it, because we do extraordinary things in the oil and gas business. I just spent last week in the Permian, and I was on a fully electric drilling rig with 1 person working on it. Fully electric with 1 person working on it, and that drilling rig was going down a 1 mile ladder, 1 mile vertically and 3 miles horizontally, and that's phenomenal. And it was going to hit a target at that 3 mile point that was 20 feet by 20 feet. Isn't that incredible?
That's amazing.
And how, so what that's kind of what we do, but how we do it is really important. And I think that's the environmental impact. And I think we need to step up the game. And so, and I think we've been doing that over time, but the pressures have become greater to step it up faster. And I will rise to the challenge to be able to do that. But we actually should have been doing that sooner.
Do you think we should self-regulate better? Like there are good players and bad players, and we're very hesitant to call out bad players.
I think we need to share, smaller companies, some way we need to find ways to help bring them along. Because like when I was in the Permian, you can see that everyone knows the dominant producers out there, and you kind of look at the smaller producers and they can't do it.
Yeah.
So it's competition, and as a country, you'd like to say, let's just develop this resource for the best use of the country, because it's going to be valuable to what we do. So I think we do a lot of good things. I think we need to step up and look at things differently.
I appreciate that as your final words. I'm going to give you final words here too.
Well, I just need to make one more final word.
All right.
So when you leave today, and you talk to someone, you say, "Can you believe what he said? That Greg said?" It's always this Greg.
Right.
That said that. It is not me.
Excellent.
I've been having that issue with him for a long time. So.
Right.
I would offer just one word, and I'll go back to make sure your comp practices, because the board, the number one issue is succession and comp, or the number 1 and 2 issue are succession and comp. If you can align comp with your environmental goals and ensuring you're doing the right things the right way, I think you'll be successful. But I think you got to do a real gut check. Are we really paying for the performance we thought we asked for?
Yeah.
Well, these are two great board members, no matter what the topic, because you were able to handle this topic extraordinarily well because you care deeply about it. Right. You understand what it means to drive strategy and performance, and you're able to take this risk and put it into that language. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anna.